Welcome to the Flight Club Podcast, a woman's guide to leaning out. We give you a behind-the-scenes look at business launch and growth through the stories of successful female entrepreneurs. Here's your host, Felina Hansen, founder and CEO of Hera Hub.
Hello and welcome. I am really excited for my conversation. We are going to be talking about all things sustainability and a buzzword that has really been talked about in the media recently for the last few years, and something that corporations are really focused on right now, which is ESG, environmental social governance. And my guest today is Chrissa Pagitsas, is a sought-after public speaker and strategic advisor to senior executives on the intersection of sustainability, environmental social governance, also known as ESG, and global business. Chrissa is the author of the book Chief Sustainability Officers at Work, which explores the leadership strategies of chief sustainability officers at Fortune 500 companies, including Coca-Cola, Duke Energy, IKEA, and Procter & Gamble, just to name a few. Welcome to the show today, Chrissa.
Thank you so much for having me, Felina.
Absolutely. This is a hot topic, talked about a lot in the media recently. Interestingly enough, looking at this topic and coming from a small business angle, and that's something I'd like to bring into the conversation too. How can small businesses, really look at their impact and how they are bringing ESG into their businesses? Because I think a lot of times we think about this as your work, what are Fortune 500 companies doing? And that's important, but how do we bring this in to a small business environment? So we'll get to that. But before
Sounds great.
Yeah. But before we do, I want to go back and learn about your background and what led you up to launching your business. So I know you're originally from Boston, were raised there in Cambridge. How did that inform some of the decisions that you made later in life and some of the early educational decisions you made?
Felina, it's funny looking back at our history and how much we either realize belatedly it may have influenced our final career and our passion. I grew up in a brick apartment building in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Nothing fancy, let me tell you. It was behind a fire station, across the street from a jazz club and a dentist office. But my work 20 years later, maybe I should actually say 40 years later, was supporting families in apartment buildings like the one that I grew up in, by creating better quality housing. That is green apartment buildings, energy efficient apartment buildings, water efficient apartment buildings. So I grew up in Cambridge, as you mentioned, and I am an immigrant. My parents came over from Greece to pursue graduate studies in the US. And over the course of growing up there, I ended up going to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore for my undergrad, and then graduating and landing as a consultant in the energy sector. There was no intent to move into energy and the utilities space, but it just so happened that that is a job that would take me to global locations and global clients, which was ultimately what I wanted to do. But through working in the energy sector, starting in the year 2000, I started learning about energy efficiency, about solar panels, about renewable technologies. And then that led me to my position eventually at Fannie Mae, where I was working with multifamily buildings, apartment family buildings, and helping make them more greener and energy efficient, and built a green bond business. So from an apartment building to Fannie Mae and working in mortgages, somehow the dots connected over the course of 40 years.
I love that. I love that. Okay, so I want to dive in and go back here a bit into like early education, frankly. was energy of interest to you, right out of the gate, or did you have a class or a professor or somebody that influenced you to really become passionate about this industry?
It's so interesting. When I went to college in 1996, my goal was to work actually in the Foreign Service. I speak Greek, I speak Spanish, I speak a little bit of German and French, and feel very much important that international relations are critical. So I went to be a political scientist. I graduated with an international relations degree, and I thought, indeed, I was going to the Foreign Service. There was, interestingly, one class that ended up really influencing me, but not immediately, and not one that I considered changing for my path to be a Foreign Service officer. But it was a class, an anthropology department class, discussing water rights and access to natural resources, and how indigenous people, particularly in Africa, over 25 years ago, and that's when I was taking this class, were struggling as a result of those issues. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't work specifically in water rights. I don't work in with a focus on the continent of Africa, but scarcity of resources is fundamentally what that class was about. And it ended up being something that I think about in my work in commercial real estate, to finance, to any of the clients that I help, whether they're in the pharmaceutical industry or other industries. So there was no big bang, Felina, in terms of one sustainability class. I don't think they existed, frankly.
I know,
when I was
exactly.
in college, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
But the segue really was when I started working, I did not end up going to the Foreign Service. I realized that I wanted to go to countries that I wanted to choose. In the Foreign Service, you don't get to choose where you get sent. Yeah. So I worked for a consulting company that had international offices, and that was my way of getting overseas. And I ended up indeed working in the Netherlands for a year for a utilities client there, as well as multiple clients in the US. And those were traditional energy companies, and I worked specifically on billing systems. It's not very sexy, Felina. You might see a theme also in my career when we start talking about mortgages. But it was really interesting because the utilities industry in 2000 was starting to be disrupted. Mm-hmm. It was being disrupted by large-scale energy systems, renewable energy systems coming online and tapping into the distribution and transmission systems. Yeah. Right. So for context, in 2000, the world surpassed 1 gigawatt of solar energy. Today, almost 25 years later, we're over at 900 gigawatts. That's a huge change. Yeah. But it opened my eyes to energy and renewable energy, and really moved me into a space to start thinking about how do we reduce that energy from dirty fuel sources to cleaner fuel sources. Mm-hmm. And then it took me to thinking about, well, who uses energy? Well, buildings do. Buildings actually use about 40% of the energy. That's according to the US EPA. And then how can green buildings actually create better quality of life for families, whether low-income families or immigrant families like my own, or just any family living in the US and in the world. And that's what eventually took me to Fannie Mae in 2010, after my career had moved into this space, to start up the green financing business for Fannie Mae.
Okay, great. Let's talk about that. I want to talk about your time at Fannie Mae, but I also want to go back to this topic of disruption, right? Mm-hmm. Anytime you have a very established industry with very established, energy sources, this is disruptive, right? And
that's right.
A lot of folks, I'm sure you experienced this through your career, seeing the push-pull of that disruption. So I don't know if you want to tackle that now or come back to that or tie that into your time at Fannie Mae. I'll leave that up to you.
Well, it is interesting. I would say when things are being disrupted, when most people notice, it means that the disruption has been happening for a while. It's just that it hasn't risen to collective conscious mass understanding or just general media coverage. So you know, in some ways, when I started being involved in this energy efficiency, green building space, it was fairly early on in the process, but it was not something that was being covered in the Wall Street Journal. It wasn't something that was being covered in a way that was, again, the collective conscious, but my clients were feeling it. They were feeling it because they had customers who were asking them to do something about it. And then they had to start adapting. And it's been 20 years of adaptation since then. And so over my career of 20 years plus now in this intersection of sustainability and business, I've seen multiple, with maybe sub-waves of disruption, right? First, there was commercialization of renewable energy, right? Then you started seeing the growth of green buildings and green certified buildings. You might be familiar, Felina, with the US Green Building Council, for example, and their LEED certification, the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. That actually, the first certified building also actually happened in 2000 as well. And now there's over 100,000 globally. And then the wave started moving into green financing, very slowly, but green financing, and then green bonds. And so all of these disruptions occur, but they don't occur all at once. And then they occur in waves. And there's really a ripple effect as we move from energy efficiency to green building, to green financing, to green bonds. And now we're looking at green funds and mutual funds and green companies. So it's been fascinating to watch disruption over the last 20 plus years with sustainability in business.
I bet. My goodness. Okay. I want to get into, I understand the concept of investing in companies who have a triple bottom line, if you will, are focused on making the world a better place. But what exactly is green financing?
So green financing is when generally it's from a lending institution, whether it's a bank or a mortgage company, provides funds, so capital, to another entity, another business entity for their general business, right? Whether it's to build a building, whether it's to make a product for consumers, to provide a service, but it has a green impact, meaning by going through that funding process and building that new product or that new building, you're actually reducing the environmental impact. So it could be using less energy. It could be using less water. It could be, for example, preserving an environmental resource or rehabilitating a resource as a result of doing your business as normal. So in the case of real estate, when I think of real estate, I think of the homes that you and I live in, whether it's a single family home, whether it's a condo, or whether we rent in an apartment building. Generally, all of these buildings have mortgages on them. Mm-hmm. And so what I built at Fannie Mae was for apartment building owners, a green loan, or specifically a green mortgage, that incentivized owners to make investments in that property to reduce its environmental impact. So how does an apartment building become more energy efficient? How does it become more water efficient while also lowering the bills, not only for the owners, but the families that live in them?
Makes sense. Okay, awesome. So providing folks incentives to build in a way that is green were people demanding this? Was it a push? Was it a pull? And explain Fannie Mae a bit. I mean, so you joined the company in 2010. Mm-hmm. This is right after we heard the names Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae in the news quite a bit just a couple years prior. So if you would, for folks who aren't familiar, explain the role of Fannie Mae.
Sure. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are GSEs, government-sponsored enterprises. They're not actually government agencies like the US EPA, for example, or the Department of Labor, but they were chartered by Congress to support the housing market in the United States, to support its affordability and liquidity. And what the GSEs function as, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, is secondary lenders. So when we talk about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, we don't say, I got a Fannie Mae loan or a Freddie Mac loan. We say, I got a Wells Fargo loan or a PNC loan, or there's many other banks and mortgage lenders. But all of those lenders, there's probably over 2,000 between the two organizations, probably more at this point, they generally actually sell those loans to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in order that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac can package them into mortgage-backed securities or commercial mortgage-backed securities and provide them as an investment solution to bond investors. That chain, Felina, from you and me as individual mortgage holders to the primary lender, Wells Fargo, secondary lender, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and then to an investor is what allows capital to flow. It means that when capital comes from the bond investor, it actually means more capital is available for more mortgages. So when I joined in 2010, both of the organizations were very much focused on keeping people in their homes, which was the main priority and absolutely is a priority for both organizations today. But when I joined in 2010, my role was to think about how can we get that mortgage for apartment buildings to do something more? How can we get the actual cost of renting to go down? How can we actually improve the quality, the durability, the comfort of those by thinking about it from a green perspective? So my work was to take that mortgage and to build in both the structures. So when I think of structure, I think credit and asset management, things that actually form the loan. And how do we also communicate this value add to both the mortgage taker, basically the person who's the borrower, but also to the bond investor ultimately who says, you know what, not only do I want a Fannie Mae loan, I actually want a Fannie Mae green bond backed by a green mortgage. And that's the one that I'm going to invest in. And that's what I was brought on board to do, to figure out how do you bring all these pieces together within the mortgage supply chain and make something bigger. So it was a new idea. It was a new idea. And it wasn't one that was, top priority for the organization, but it was one that they started exploring and said, yes, Chrissa, see what you can figure out.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you so much for explaining that. I really, really appreciate it. And then you moved into the role as vice president, head of ESG in 2019, and stayed with the agency for a couple more years. And obviously, that's part of the work that you're doing now in the book and the interviews you've done.
Sure.
Talk a little bit about what you've seen in this area of ESG. Some folks may have only heard about this acronym a few years ago. Obviously, the concept has been around for a long time, but I think that, as I mentioned at the top, the media has been talking about this a little more over the last few years. So environmental, social governance, right? Companies
That's right.
thinking about their impact on the environment, socially, and how do they manage this? Talk about that role there at Fannie Mae, and then let's transition into what inspired you to go talk to other Fortune 500 companies and organizations to really understand what they were doing around this ESG model.
So, it's interesting that the ESG concept really was grounded, really has come out of the financial services industry first. And a lot of it was looking at by investors on how do you look at a company in the same way that they look at traditional financial reports and say, okay, this is the company's performance. Great, we understand it. How can we also look at their environmental and social and governance performance, but also risks? And it was a natural evolution for me to start at Fannie Mae in 2010, figuring out the green financing business and then building it to $51 billion and move into that head of ESG role for the company because I'd had those conversations with the investors. What is a green bond? Why is the Fannie Mae green bond good? What are the metrics that show what the risks and opportunities are? So ESG is a companion concept to the concept of sustainability, which has been around for many years. I'd say probably 30 to 40 years in some of the earliest literature. But it is a little bit different because it is focusing on risk management, and it's looking at it primarily from almost a financial perspective. How can you quantify the impact and the risks in a way that investors can use it? So they're companion concepts, but a little bit different.
Thank you for explaining that. I've never looked at it that way. That's really interesting coming out of, from a financial lens. It's really interesting.
What I can tell you is that for me, as leading that role at Fannie Mae was fantastic because it really was raising the conversation with our senior leadership, raising the conversation with our board about how do we have impact, and really thinking about how does sustainability, ESG, green financing, green bonds get embedded throughout the company. And what that means is, what are we doing in HR around D&I? Fannie Mae has a strong program in that space, but how do we communicate that to investors? How do we work with audit? How do we think about our IT systems? How do we think about climate risk? And how do we think about social impact? And so ESG really is that umbrella concept, which I was drawn to, and I had the privilege of leading at Fannie Mae for over 2 years. But I would say that from 2010 to 2021, which is when I left, so 11 years there, it was also a wonderful learning opportunity about what it takes to lead these types of big strategies for large companies. And that's why I left in March of 2021 to write about it, to interview my peers at other large companies like Procter & Gamble and Netflix, to JP Morgan Chase, to BlackRock, and ask them, hey, how did you do it? How did you grow your business? How did you make ESG a part of your normal day? What do you do as a chief sustainability officer? And the stories, the narratives in this book really are intended to help other leaders who are trying to figure it out, see what others have done successfully, take a page from their book and implement it no matter what size of their company, whether it's a $50 billion in revenue company, or maybe it's a $50,000 company in revenue. There's a lot of leadership lessons that these people have shared with me, and they're just incredible and applicable to any leader in any industry.
Such a helpful tool, right? Where you're really, making sure that other companies maybe, and this ties back to my question earlier, is, such important information in this book, but how do we apply that to small business owners?
Well, every business owner, regardless of their size, makes decisions about their processes. And what I mean by that is when you choose to hire a vendor, maybe even to help you with your content marketing, you're actually choosing the type of vendor that follows your values. Are you choosing a vendor that not only supports your business, but also might benefit in a way because they are an underrepresented supplier, for example? Have they been in a space where they haven't been recognized for their services just based on the race of the founder, for example, or the sex of the founder? So that, to me, Felina, any company can think about supplier diversity, which really is social impact, which is really a core pillar of ESG. And that's just one small example of how any company of any size can think about ESG.
That's great. That's a good example. Love it. I do want to get into something that I've been, again, the media, God bless them, right? We've seen, and I've read a bit too, even a Forbes article that I have up right now, why pushback on ESG is good for ESG. So there has been, why has there been a pushback?
Well, I think there's a variety of reasons. I think the Chief Sustainability Officer role and head of ESG role is one of the hardest roles in the C-suite. And that's because you're expected to both have technical expertise in a wide variety of topics, everything from carbon emissions to supplier diversity to employee diversity and philanthropy. And you're expected to be able to tap into the business strategy, so generate revenue or reduce expenses, and navigate everybody's personal beliefs, whether Republican, Democrat, highly conservative, highly liberal, highly religious, not religious, and of all sorts of backgrounds. It is a tight rope walk. And the pushback, yeah, it's a very difficult role. I think more difficult than pretty much all the roles on the C-suite. But I think that the pushback that's coming is coming from two sides. I think one side is coming that, listen, this is still a relatively new space. We need to get consensus. We need to get some confirmation around what's the minimum standard. And I think that's good. I think that's absolutely good because every industry goes through maturities phases, and pushback is good in that space. On the flip side, the other side that I think is a little bit more challenging is the question of what's business's fundamental purpose. And so there's the famous Milton Friedman commentary around the only purpose of business is essentially business, right? In order to create shareholder value.
Yeah,
bottom
exactly.
line. But what ESG and sustainability challenge is that without stakeholders, without society, without a healthy environment, there is no business. There are no consumers. If there is no environment to pull resources from, there will be no shareholder value. Yeah. And I think that's where, when there's pushback around incorporating these elements of environmental and social considerations, that the argument goes astray, that the pushback is pushing on the wrong thing. But that is where I think the two sources are. And I think one is going to help us all collectively get better. And I hope on the second side, where there is pushback that there is no role for environmental and social considerations, I do hope that steadier and clearer heads win out and explain that we all work together. We're an ecosystem, and that ecosystem needs to take into account all of these pieces in order for us to be successful.
Absolutely. So let's talk a bit more about the book. It must have been fun, for lack of a better word, to go
It was a lot of fun.
Interesting, and doing all these interviews. Talk about the book itself. How has it been received, and some of the work that you're doing, now as a consultant, sure, around the book and beyond.
So the book was really a moment for me to reflect on the experiences that I had building first a green financing business to $50 billion, then being the first head of ESG, and recognizing that there were other people who had lessons to share. And so I started by contacting my network, my peers, and saying, would you like to be interviewed? And they said yes, which was wonderful. Emma Stewart, for example, at Netflix said yes immediately. Catherine Neby, CSO of Duke Energy. And then the network just kept expanding. You should interview this person. This is who you should interview. And it's fascinating to hear themes, Felina, in people's conversations. There are 24 companies profiled. And the themes that they talked about, whether they are in Anheuser-Busch and beverage and food, to Owens Corning and glass manufacturer, to financial services, was you need to have strong partnerships, internal and external. You need to make sure that you stay focused on innovating on your processes and your products, and how do you integrate sustainability into that is absolutely fundamental. And frankly, you actually also need to be very patient. And I say patient because you have to know when to sort of push the pedal down and move something forward. And then sometimes you have to really understand when an organization needs to take a beat to catch up with the new process, the new product, in order to get buy-in. So while the stories individually are different, there are common themes. And I call those themes the 5 Ps. It's knowing the priorities, being able to invest in patience, integrating with products, catalyzing process and systems change, and forging new partnerships. It was wonderful to work on the book and to interview these leaders.
Absolutely. So consulting wise, talk about some of the work that you're doing now, and then also talk about what's coming up in the future. What are some of the things that you're looking forward to? Do you have another book in you?
Well, a few things are going on, and they're all quite exciting. So one, I do have a set of clients that I support, and it's been wonderful work to work very closely with heads of ESGs and chief sustainability officers. So one of my primary advisor services, Felina, is being that confidant, that strategic advisor, whether they're a new CSO or an experienced one, and being that sounding board, because I've been in the seat, I've written about it, and I've certainly seen many clients and how they're navigating it. So that's one thing that I do. And another one is having some tough conversations with boards. And I say that not that it's a negative or a friction-filled conversation, but it's a conversation with boards where it is board education, but also about what is your ambition for the company that you're stewarding? What would you like to see them achieve in the space of environmental and social? And how does that marry up with peers? So one of my roles is strategic advisor to CSOs and their teams, and another is board education and conducting these workshops with senior executives. And then the other thing that I do, which I absolutely love, is I love public speaking. I have had the pleasure of speaking to audiences of 1,000 people, audiences of 50 people, and doing opening keynotes and doing virtual. And to me, it's a way to catalyze leadership. How do we get us as individuals, not just Fortune 500 companies, the big monoliths, but how does each one of those 1,000 people in the audience that I speak to leave after those 60 minutes and think about, this is how I'm going to lead in my role, whatever seat I have in the organization, but take that sustainability mindset to maybe change a process, maybe change a product, to start thinking about the environmental and the social impact. So those are 3 things that I do today, and super excited about all of them. And in relation to the book, I am actually happy to share with you, Felina, that I'm launching a book club. This is another way for me to sort of engage and teach and bring out the individual leaders. So hosting small session, free book clubs where we dive into topics such as leading with internal partners to operationalizing sustainability. So it's a way to bring people together and create a community, but also have people leave after digging into 2 of the chapters of the book.
I love it. Awesome. Wonderful. So, Chrissa, if folks want to learn more about you, I know you are incredibly active on LinkedIn. I've really enjoyed some of the articles that you've written and things that you've shared. The very thought-provoking, this one you shared just a couple of days ago, the 2 truths and a lie.
Yes.
Particularly interesting. So I certainly encourage folks to go find you on LinkedIn and follow you on LinkedIn. How else would you like folks to get in touch with you if they want to know more?
Thanks, Felina. So LinkedIn, yes, very active. I can also be reached directly from my website, pagitsasadvisors.com, and happy to hear from listeners, and would love to even do a book club for listeners in their organization. So would love to hear from folks.
Great idea. Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Chrissa.
Thank you, Felina. This was lovely.
Thank you for joining this week's episode of Flight Club, sponsored by Hera Hub. We look forward to sharing more success stories with you soon.